Eric Dolphy is among the foremost supernovas in all of jazz. He burned very brightly and very briefly, and then he was gone. All jazz musicians have their own style, but some surely have more unique styles than others. Eric Dolphy's sound continues to fascinate people because it was not just different, but radical in its refusal to bow to convention. Like pianist Thelonious Monk, he was an inspirational artist in the sense that he did not compromise his style for critical approval. His abrasive, unpredictable solos are exhilarating and endlessly inventive, but they did not please everyone. One high-profile critic was Miles Davis, who famously said Dolphy played the sax like someone was stepping on his feet. But later in his autobiography, he said, "Dolphy could play, I just didn't like the way he played." Dolphy was an impressive multi-instrumentalist. He made some masterful recordings on the flute and bass clarinet, as well as alto sax. The controversy surrounding Dolphy's tragic death in 1964, cutting short his remarkable, if brief, career, reminds us that Black jazz musicians have always encountered widespread racism, but the case of Dolphy brings this to a whole new level. As such, stereotyping literally left him for dead. On June 27, 1964, Dolphy traveled to Berlin to play with a trio led by Carl Berger at the opening of a jazz club. He was apparently seriously ill when he arrived, and during the first concert was barely able to play. He was hospitalized that night, but his condition worsened. On June 29th, Dolphy died after falling into a diabetic coma. While certain details of his death are still disputed, it is largely accepted that he fell into a coma caused by undiagnosed diabetes. The liner notes to the complete Prestige Recordings box set say that Dolphy collapsed in his hotel room in Berlin, and when brought to the hospital, he was diagnosed as being in a diabetic coma. After being administered a shot of insulin, he lapsed into insulin shock and died. A later documentary and liner notes dispute this, saying Dolphy collapsed on stage in Berlin and was brought to a hospital. Allegedly, the attending hospital physicians did not know Dolphy was a diabetic who did not smoke cigarettes or take drugs, deciding, based on a stereotype of jazz musicians, that he had overdosed on drugs. In this account, he was left in a hospital bed for the drugs to run their course. Ted Kurson recalled the following: "That really broke me up. When Eric got sick in Berlin, and him being black and a jazz musician, they thought he was a junkie. Eric didn't use any drugs. He was a diabetic. All they had to do was take a blood test, and they would have found that out. So he died for nothing. They gave him some detox stuff, and he died." We will never know what masterpieces he might have gone on to produce and, more tragically, what his life would have been like with the classical dancer to whom he had recently been engaged. What is certain is that, while short, his career was still long enough to have a lasting impact on a crowded jazz scene, and was one of the great originals of American music. Dolphy, born in Los Angeles in 1928, may have seemed like a late starter. His first major public role came in 1958 as part of the Chico Hamilton Quintet, but he was actually a precocious artist who cultivated his art devotedly, privately, and in the company of like-minded musicians who knew of his talent long before the world at large got to hear it. Dolphy practiced and studied obsessively. His fluency and proficiency rivaled Coltrane's in his years of study. He developed techniques and ideas that, when he did emerge publicly, in Hamilton's group, were fully formed. His main instrument was alto sax, on which he used a full, ringing, siren-like tone that's instantly recognizable. He also played flute, clarinet, and especially an instrument that hardly any other jazz musicians used, the bass clarinet. His sound and style on it were so distinctive that to this day, the instrument is closely identified with him. It does not quite seem possible that such a relatively young musician could master 3 instruments. In actuality, Dolphy was an exceedingly accomplished alto sax player. Perhaps most egregiously disregarded is his flute playing, which not only achieves a consistent and uncommon beauty, but more than holds its own against fellow musicians. Nevertheless, it is the signature, unmistakable sounds he makes with the bass clarinet that ensures his place in history. No one of a note, except Harry Carney, employed this instrument on the front line before Dolphy, and, arguably, no one has used it as effectively since. Let there be no doubt that Eric Dolphy warrants mention amongst jazz music's all-time immortals. Eric Allen Dolphy was born in Los Angeles, the only child of Sadie and Eric Dolphy Sr., both of West Indian descent. After demonstrating promise on his elementary school-issued harmonica, Dolphy picked up the clarinet, and while still in junior high school, he received a scholarship to study at the University of Southern California School of Music. Encouraging his talents, Dolphy's parents built him a shed behind their home in which he could rehearse with his various ensembles. After graduating from high school, Dolphy studied music at Los Angeles City College, and he made his first known recorded appearances with the Roy Porter Band in 1949. In 1950, Dolphy entered the U.S. Army and was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. Following his discharge, Dolphy worked in Los Angeles in relative obscurity for several years, until in 1959, he earned a position in drummer Chico Hamilton's quintet. After touring extensively, Dolphy left Hamilton and moved to New York City, where he re-established his relationship with fellow Californian Charles Mingus, a personal and musical relationship which would grow until Dolphy's death. The exposure Dolphy received as part of Mingus's jazz workshop led to numerous opportunities as both a sideman and a leader, including Dolphy's own 1960 debut, Outward Bound. Highlights of Eric Dolphy's recording career as a leader include several studio albums for Prestige, one for Blue Note, the remarkable Out to Lunch, and 3 albums worth of live material from his and trumpeter Booker Little's 2-week residency at the 5 Spot in New York. As a sideman, Dolphy also made significant contributions to such albums as Andrew Hill's Point of Departure, Oliver Nelson's The Blues and the Abstract Truth, Max Roach's percussion Bittersweet, Booker Little's Out Front, and Ornette Coleman's double quartet album Free Jazz. From 1961 to 1963, Eric Dolphy also regularly performed with John Coltrane's Classic Quartet, where he generated much of his most acclaimed work. With Coltrane and pianist McCoy Tyner, Dolphy arranged the orchestrations of Coltrane's 1961 album, Africa Brass, and he was a major contributor to Coltrane's Live at the Village Vanguard recordings of the same year. Improved musical documentation of this period has shown just how integral Dolphy was to the ensemble, a point which was minimized by the initial records. In many respects, Coltrane regarded Dolphy as uniquely suited to explore his musical ideas, and as with Mingus, the influence was clearly reciprocal. Classical music played a large role in Dolphy's early training and remained important to him. Dolphy performed and recorded Edgard Varèse's Density for solo flute, as well as other classical works. Dolphy's work is sometimes classified as free jazz, though he insisted that his compositions and solos were grounded in a thorough, if occasionally unorthodox, use of harmony. He is often compared to Ornette Coleman. Along with Coltrane and Coleman, Eric Dolphy played a significant role in influencing the development of the avant-garde in jazz in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He featured on Coleman's Free Jazz from 1960 and toured and recorded extensively with both Mingus and Coltrane. He developed a style of playing that was wholly his own, characterized by unorthodox note-to-chord relationships. Though not the first, Dolphy's unaccompanied solo recordings on alto sax, bass clarinet, and flute proved to be influential in paving a path for other musicians to follow. A thoroughly schooled musician, able to read the most complex music at sight, he was, in short, a true jazz original. Even today, Dolphy's significance is not lost on many leading contemporary jazz musicians, such as Steve Coleman, who said, "Dolphy was the first guy I heard play the hell out of the bass clarinet, the alto sax, and the flute. I mean, he was killing everything. He was a virtuoso." Tales of Eric Dolphy's gentle, compassionate nature are almost as legendary as his musicianship. Richard Davis remembered Eric as a beautiful person and said, "Even when he didn't have enough for himself, he'd try to help others. I remember how he once bought groceries for a friend who was out of work, though he was just as much in need himself." Charles Mingus simply referred to Eric as a saint and named his son Eric Dolphy Mingus. in his honor. This is One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.